All right. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I believe my guest is morning, if I remember correctly, which is very, very strange for me because in about an hour or two, I'll be heading to bed, and then I think he's gonna be going on about his day. But anyways, you guys aren't here to hear me discuss that. China. I've focused a lot on this in the foreign policy aspect on this show quite a bit, and I'm sure we'll cover that a little bit today too. But I'm very, very interested in China in particular because this is kind of like the US's big goal. And if you've paid attention to any alt media, particularly more right leaning media, you just get propaganda that's at the most insane stuff you've ever heard of your entire life. Stuff that I've debunked on this show about, a supposed genocide going on or social credit scores, about how China's going to overtake the world and stuff like this. We'll probably break some of that down today, and then what it's like to actually live in China, which to me just seems absolutely fascinating. You aren't here to hear me talk about my travels, but if you can't tell, I'm a little bit darker. I just got back from Florida, and my guest today said that he is experiencing some heat over there in the Asian part of the hemisphere as well. So make sure you go to all the links below to find where you can find my guest, everything he's got going on, everything I've got going on. Tiger Fitness for all your supplements through the links below, and Fox and Sons Coffee. Use code Kyle at checkout. And without further ado, let's rock and roll.
Hey Kyle, I think you're muted.
All right, we're good now. Jason, welcome to the show, man.
Hey. Yeah, it's nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me on, Kyle. I saw that you had Carl John recently. He's been on my show a few times, and he's also in this time zone almost. So,
Mhm.
yeah, I think you're probably used to getting staying up late or getting up early, whichever it is.
Yeah, well, right now I'm been home from work for a few hours, and this is kind of like the ideal time for me. So I know it's pretty early in the morning for you, so I really, really appreciate that. Carl was awesome, and in fact, that show did really, really well for me. And he clipped part of that and put the clip out when Tiananmen Square was kind of popping off again when everybody was talking about that. So before we start diving into some of that, why don't you let my audience know who you are and what you're known for and what you do?
Well, primarily, I'm a radio show host in Beijing, which is unusual for an American. So I have a radio
Mhm.
show here in Beijing. We also play in Samoa and Tonga, and it's a podcast. You can find us. We're called the Bridge Podcast. There's a couple Bridge podcasts. We're the one with Acorn Studio. So if you want to Google that, you can find us. We have a YouTube and stuff. I do some writing also, and primarily, my goal is to be an American in China and to look through American eyes at China and tell my American friends what is it like. Really.
Nice. Yeah. Well, like I said in the introduction, that stuff is just absolutely fascinating to me because we hear so much about China and, of course, the big scary CCP, which I've heard you say correctly, which is CPC. Um, but this, just the whole subject of China is so interesting because a friend of mine, Pat McFarlane, who also takes great interest in China, had kind of said that we've essentially been propagandized from birth to really hate China. So I'm kind of curious if that was your experience growing up in America and moving to China, or what kind of prompted you to move over there and see it for yourself.
Well, I mean, what prompted me was not knowing about it. And I'm a really curious person. Wherever I don't know, whatever I don't know about, that's what I'm going to be reading about or learning about. I remember though, my grandma, she is passed, but at the time she was in her like late 80s, early 90s. And before I moved to China in 2012, she said, "Jason, do you know they're communists?" And I was like, "Yes, yes, it's okay, Grandma. I know they're communists." So then I came over here and experienced China. But yeah, I had the same perceptions of what China was going to be like as everyone else, having grown up with the same movies and the same television and growing up in suburban America and California. But China turned out to be quite different from the way that our media portrays it. And I read a lot of U.S. media now, and it's still very different from the portrayals that are going on now. And I don't even think it's disinformation. I think sometimes it is, but I think it's also there's just a huge echo chamber. So the Bloomberg will post something, and then the New York Times wants to be relevant, so they'll bounce
Mhm.
something off of the idea that Bloomberg posted. And then you'll have some other media outlet, the Washington Post, they'll be kind of echoing the same thing. and you get PhDs at universities who only visit China intermittently or who studied China from the West, and they're bouncing out the same ideas. And it just becomes this really big echo chamber that seems to even the people inside of it legitimate, that they're
Mhm.
actually looking at China through like a realistic lens. And I think the think tankers in Washington D.C., at least a great deal of them, really think that they do have it all figured out. And it couldn't be further from the truth, because I'm an avid reader. I've read more than 10,000 books. I'm one of those super nerds that doesn't do anything except
Mhm.
learn. That's all I do. Learning is my religion. And the people in DC have no idea what China is really like. If you look at think tankers, what they're saying, if you look at academics, what they're saying, and if you look at media, what they're saying, America is lost on China. We need to reboot and kind of like really look at what China really is past the perceptions that we've built up about it, because we're
Mhm.
blinding ourselves.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Now, I guess it kind of begs the question there as well. How does China view the U.S. and particularly kind of our relationship over, let's say, the last 12 years, really? Because I'm sure you know that over the last 12 years, it was basically Obama that launched the pivot to Asia, which is basically focusing our foreign policy from, fighting wars on terror to now what they call great power struggles, which was subsequently ramped up by Donald Trump and then even more ramped up by Joe Biden, which is kind of opposite of like the common, let's say right wing knowledge is, typically Trump threw it out in the debate that Biden's a Manchurian candidate. But I know it's kind of a long tangent, but how does China and the Chinese people view the US?
It's really fascinating. It's really different than one might expect.
Mhm.
One of the things that Americans, almost all Americans, have in common is that we are critical of our own government. It's part of our culture. So, going as a Californian who was critical of a lot of things about the United States to China, I was like, okay, these are going to be people who are also critical of China. And I very quickly met some, high ranking folks, and we were sitting at dinner. And I was like, oh, yeah, United States, what they did in Iraq, that was terrible. And they were like, "Oh, no, no, you don't understand, Jason. China, America's like our big brother. We look up to them." And I was like, "Really?" And
Mhm.
this was like 2014 or 13. I was kind of taken aback by the fact that very powerful people here in China actually really have an enormous amount of respect for the United States. And so it changed my entire like political science paradigm. Chinese people are not over here looking at the United States and thinking about like what do we need to do to like damage the US, and it's not like that at all. They look, a lot of the policies that China has adopted over the years have been things that the US did first. The
Mhm.
US has a national park system. It's the first in the world. We have like Yosemite and like what's that, Yellowstone, and all of those
Yeah.
national parks. And China was like, that's a brilliant idea. We've never had in our 5,000-year history a national park system. So they created a national park system because they look up to the United States. China is really good at looking around the world for examples of how it could improve itself and adopting those. And it looks to the United States very often. I mean, the success of Ford, we're going back in history a little bit, is like basically that's how China wanted to model its industry. It's like, okay, what did the US do? Okay, let's try doing some of that. And China is still doing that, even at the
Mhm.
same time while China is starting to outflank the US in certain industries and in certain ways and techniques. China's not like, haha, we win. No, China's still like looking at the US, looking at what does work
Mhm.
and trying to replicate those successes. So I think that there's, right now there's a lot of people in China, especially since in the last 4 or 5 years, that have increasingly been like, we should be concerned. The US seems really like aggressive,
Mhm.
but there's still a deep respect for the power that the United States has and some of the ways that the United States operates, especially the university system. China is still trying to learn from the US university system.
Hmm. That's actually fascinating. And I've never heard anybody lay it out that way, which really is kind of sad when you think about it because we don't have to be competitors, so to speak. Like you could say we're competitors in respect, like, hey, we both want to, outdo each other economically and like bring better prosperity about for our individual populations, but not at the expense of one another. Like we're competing to be better in that respect, but not like a competition in terms of we're going to subvert one another to bring the other down. This should be a competition that lifts all boats, so to speak. So, I mean, one thing that you said in there was kind of China looking around and seeing ways that they can improve their system. And a common criticism that's levied at China a lot is that they tend to steal a lot of intellectual property, which, me being a libertarian, I think that's a ridiculous concept. I understand the idea like, hey, you worked on something and you put your labor and time into it, but if somebody else can make it better and for less resources, why should we not, reward that person more for, being able to bring people better product? Um, so what's the whole deal with the IP theft stuff? And what do you think about that when you hear people criticize China for that?
I think a lot of different things about it. So I don't want to
Sure.
misrepresent the reality here.
Of course.
In the past, I think this is not as much the case anymore, but in the past, China has in fact created these contractual systems where if you wanted to manufacture something in China, and that's primarily what Westerners wanted to do with China for the last several decades.
Hmm.
Import export. If you go on Facebook and look up China groups, right, and you start scrolling down, it's clear that like three out of four of all of the Facebook groups are import export groups. They literally just say import export import export. They're all these groups on Facebook.
Hmm.
So the interest for the West has historically been modern history. Let's make stuff in China. And so when these factories come over, they have to JV, joint venture with a Chinese company. Not anymore. This law changed like in the last year. It's actually
Hmm.
now Westerners can open companies on their own. But in the past, they JV'd. And part of that is a tech transfer. And this actually came from the Nixon era. So in the Nixon era, and before that, let's go back to 1950s. In the 1950s, China took a bunch of loans from the Soviet Union. And part of taking those loans to start building up its manufacturing base was tech transfers. So Russia would come in, they would help build a factory. And part of that was China could keep some of the technology from how that factory operated, how it made whatever, products that it was making. Eventually, the Soviet Union and China fell out and they weren't getting along so well in the early 60s. So when Nixon came in, China was really desperate for modern technology. And so one of the part of how they set up that was all these IMF loans came into China, which China actually managed very successfully, unlike a lot of other countries around the world. And part of that was tech transfers. So how do you make the things that U.S. wanted to make in China? So China learned that deliberately. The United States taught China that deliberately. And so China took a lot of that technology and was able to replicate manufacturing techniques that were used in the West. There's another part of that argument, and that continued up until very recently. But another part of that argument is China is stealing Western technology, and
Hmm.
that's dubious, and that there's nothing
Sure.
to that. There may be individual cases of hacker theft or stuff, but it's not like
Hmm.
some grand strategy for China to steal like IP secrets from Western institutions, like on the back end and sending spies or something. There may be
Right.
individual cases of that, like there are between any countries, but there's not like some massive strategy to do that. If you the last part of this argument is you have to go to nature.com. They are the premier institution to analyze which institutions are the best at researching STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And if you look at their list this year of the best universities in STEM in the world, 7 out of 10 of those are in China.
Hmm.
So China is actually leading the world in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. China has more patents and more fields than any country in the world, including the United States. I think the only institution that Nature put from the United States on that top 10 list of STEM universities is Harvard. That's it. That we don't
Hmm.
have any other universities in the top 10 in the world. So when people talk about China's trying to steal our ideas, no, China
Hmm.
is leading the world in almost every technology that exists, including like fusion and AI, like things that would surprise people. If you really look at the data, you're not just reading like fortune.com or something,
Hmm.
you're going to very quickly see that China has the most tech clusters, the most logistic clusters, the most science, technology, engineering, mathematics, like clusters of organizations all over China. China has more PhDs in all these fields than any other country by far. So IP theft, I mean, the US wishes it had IP China wanted to steal.
Mhm. Right. Well, that also kind of ties into something else that's a little bit more personal to me. I'm an automotive mechanic by trade, and now we're starting to see in the U.S. a lot of electric vehicles, and I'm kind of enamored with. I'm a General Motors guy, so like Buick, GMC, Cadillac, and Chevrolet are all like my squeeze, and that's kind of dealerships that I work for. and we've started to get the electric vehicle Hummers, so like the big old GMC Hummers, and I'm just absolutely
There are
enamored with
electric
them.
vehicle Hummers. This blew my mind. Wow.
Oh,
Really?
okay.
Wow.
They're the coolest thing in the world. So I mean, you literally have I think it's like a 9,500 pound Hummer that goes 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. I mean, it
Yeah,
is mind boggling.
that hits those guardrails on the side of the highway, that's like paper.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, they're just one of the coolest things to drive. And like, I know everybody loves their, God, guns, guts, and glory, your big old V8. And I have one of them too. Don't get me wrong. I love them. But like, there is something cool about a 10,000 pound vehicle that's dead silent and will blow the doors off almost anything. But kind of getting to the point was when I had Carl on, him and I had talked a little bit about this, but what's the electric vehicle market over there? Because Carl seemed to paint a pretty optimistic picture of what the electrical vehicle market is like over in China versus what it is in the US.
This is a painful thing for me because I'm a big EV person and I really
Sure.
I'm an environmentalist. Yeah, I
Hmm.
know a lot of people don't shine on that, but
Hmm.
my wife doesn't care as much. And so she got her license recently and she wants to buy a car. And the
Hmm.
EV market is so successful here that ICE cars, internal combustion engine cars, are actually dropping in value so fast you wouldn't believe it. It would make your head
Wow.
spin because people are going into EVs. More than it's like 60% of all cars on all Chinese roads are
Oh,
EVs.
wow.
Most taxi fleets are 100% EV. Most bus fleets are 100% EV. China has something like 92% of all EV buses in the world. And most of the EV buses in the United States and other countries are from China. They're
Okay,
BYD.
yeah, I hate to interrupt, but just to
Yeah.
put a pin in that, America's car market when it comes to electrics is maybe 7% as of Q4 of 2023. So that just
Wow.
tells you the difference there. So I'm,
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just felt like
No, no,
that was
no,
a
no.
good
I thought it
comparison.
was lower than that. So I think I was going to be looking for statistics soon, but
Hmm.
this may I've been telling everyone how much I care about the environment and about
Yeah.
talking about trees and all this stuff on
Hmm.
online and different platforms. And my wife finally is like, okay, we can buy a car. I was like, oh, great, get a BYD, get some Chinese car so we can test it
Hmm.
out and see what it's like for ourselves. And she wants to buy a Mercedes, and the reason is because they cost nothing. So I'm
Uh,
like, wait a minute. You want to buy a German car when we live in like the EV, factory land where like all the EVs in the entire world are basically made here. Even European EVs are actually manufactured in China now. Like Volkswagen has factories all over China. Tesla has factories all in Shanghai that one of their massive factories, which isn't actually for the Chinese market. It is for the Chinese market, but it's for Asia.
mm.
But she wants to buy a Mercedes because she found almost a brand new Mercedes that's like $4,000 US.
Oh,
And another
wow.
one like that's $5,000 US. They're just no one wants them.
Mhm.
So all these people are trying to sell their ICE cars here in China, and the used car market for these internal combustion engine cars is flooded, and you can get anything at just dirt prices right now because no one wants them, and the market's just overflowing with these kind of cars.
Mm. Yeah, that's absolutely insane to me now because the car market here, not just used, but I mean used and new, is just an absolute catastrophe. I mean the EV Hummer I was telling you about, we start those out at $115,000.
Wow.
An Escalade that we would do new is going to be anywhere from 100 to $150,000. To get a used car, they're maybe like 5 to 10 grand lower than a new car. So, and then all the EVs, like I think we have that Cadillac Lyric, which is fully electric Cadillac, and those ones are actually relatively cheap for what they are, but they're about 50 to 60 thousand dollars.
Mm.
And yeah, I don't. You would not find anything worth driving here in the U.S. for probably under $8,000.
Well, let me just give you one more thing. I just want to add
Sure.
one more piece of information. There's a car, the car I want my wife to buy, and we're still debating this because she hasn't made a purchase yet, is a BYD. It's a
Mhm.
Chinese car. It can go 2,000 kilometers. What's that, 1,500 miles or something
Mhm.
ish. Um, and it costs 80,000 RMB, which is like $12,000. Brand new car,
Wow.
top of the line.
Okay, so then I guess that leads into I was listening to the book Unrivaled, which you might be familiar with it. It was Michael Beckley had wrote it, and he's like a big think tanker here over in the U.S. And basically, his proposition was this book was put out in 2019. He had basically put forth the idea that China is doing very, very economically poorly. And he says that basically, like a lot of the stats that China puts out are generally kind of like they paint more of an optimistic picture than what's actually going on. And in that book, he kind of painted it that there's a lot of poverty in China. And once again, a lot of these stats were probably from like the last 10, 20 years, I want to say. So that being said, for I think the average income in the US is about $69,000, which about 10 years ago, I want to say it was around 39,000. So that tells you that, we're getting eaten alive by inflation. And I just told you earlier, a vehicle from General Motors, which used to be kind of like the blue collar guys, vehicle, most people like me are kind of priced out of these things. So now, all that being said, what's the average salary kind of like for the average Chinese person? I know it's probably going to vary greatly because there's so many people over there of probably different abilities, but what does the economic outlook look like for your average middle class person?
This is such a complicated question because the US
Okay,
and China are so different.
sure.
You're going to have to give me some leeway to use up a little extra time.
Now go
So,
ahead.
firstly, if you talk about the United States and you're talking about median income, it's about, yeah, like what you said. But if you take out the top 10 people, it drops 10,000 RMB because of how rich the
Mm,
rich Americans are. And if
sure.
you take out the top like 1,000 Americans, it drops another $10,000. So, I mean, you're talking the actual income, average income for a normal American who's not like, who doesn't own a yacht
Mm,
is actually much closer to like 45,000.
sure.
But it's still much higher than China. That is true. GDP per capita, especially in nominal terms, is
Mm,
higher than China. And this is why Elon Musk sometimes says China is going to become about twice or maybe three times as economically large as the United States someday. He's talking about 2050 or 2060.
mm,
Because in order to get GDP per capita in purchasing power parity terms up to where it is closer to like a first world country, or a developed country, is going to take China actually being three times the size total economy being three times the size of the United States. So purchasing power parity, Chinese still make less, but you have to look at disposable income in order to
sure.
really understand this, because US disposable income per person is actually far lower than people would anticipate because expenses are so high. You have about 90% of all Chinese people own their home outright. That means no mortgage. They own their
Mm,
home completely in cash. Most homes are bought in cash because Chinese families are super savers. So if you look at UN statistics, most Chinese persons save about 40% of their income.
wow.
And so when their kids are going to buy a house, it's like grandma and grandpa on both sides because there's one child policy for a lot of time. And most families
Mm,
don't have two or three kids, most have one or two. So then everyone helps them buy a house and they own a house. And so everyone owns a home, even millennials, it's like 80% ownership of home. So there's no rent. Rent practically doesn't exist except for people who own a home somewhere and then they're working in a city. Sometimes they rent. A lot of expats rent, and there's university students sometimes rent. There is renting economy, but it's not at the scale it is in the United States. It's not even remotely close. So you just have to take like housing out completely. So you're already freeing up like a third of people's income. So disposable income per uh, head is still lower than the United States. But you also have to look at medical. So in the United States, medical costs are insane. Even if you have
mhm,
insurance, you're paying for insurance premiums. In China, if you work, your employer provides your medical through a national system. So like 96, 97% of people are just covered right off the bat. And medical expenses, if I threw my back out, I had a slip disc and I had treatments for like 2 months every day. And it cost me total in US dollars like $50. And that
wow.
was with MRIs and stuff. We're talking like, I had steroids injected into my back, all kinds of procedures.
Mhm,
Like medical expenses don't matter really, unless you have some very, very rare disease that's extreme. Like, I wouldn't even know the name of the disease. Then maybe it's
mhm,
going to cost you more because the specialist is going to be much more expensive. It's not just going to be covered by national insurance. And then you have to look at Pension schemes exist for pretty much everyone here too. So there's not an issue with retiring, and retirement for women is 50 years old. Retirement for men is 60 years old. And so you have all of these ways that your actual personal disposable income rises. But even then, even after you account for all of that and it's done in purchasing power parity, Chinese
Mhm.
people still have less disposable income than American citizens. So that is true. But it is increasing. But the thing about it is people, because have so much savings, you go to the mall, it's full. People are buying whatever they want. People spend, like there's every kind of store you can imagine. There's every kind of convenience you can imagine. There's robots everywhere. It's crazy. If you go out into the rural areas, the Gini coefficient, which measures the difference between urban and rural areas, is a
Mhm.
little bit skewed. So the rural areas, so if you're looking at the urban areas and you're looking at disposable income per head, you're really talking, it's almost the same actually. Lifestyles are very similar. But if you go out into the rural area, it's a little bit less well off. And you go to some rural areas, like maybe in Gansu, in the rural areas, you are looking at some poverty. Now,
Mhm.
if you look at, there are different kinds of poverty. So America has a poverty line, it's like $10,000, $12,000. Yeah, so there's a lot of Chinese people living below that. But if you look at the IMF's definition of, or World Bank's definition of absolute poverty, it's like $2 or something. There's no one in China that's below that line. Zero people are living in absolute poverty. What is absolute poverty is like, can you feed yourself? Are you getting
Mhm.
enough calories and protein and stuff like that to basically survive? You have clothes. Do you have the warmth in your home in the winter? Can you heat your food to make it,
Mhm.
sterile? All those things. There's no one in that degree of poverty left in China. And that was eliminated. There were about 100 million. A lot of people hear the figure there were 800 million people living in poverty in 1980, and that was cleared up by 2020. That's actually very inaccurate. And I wanted to talk
Mhm.
about this. This is why I said I needed the extra time,
Of course.
because the way that poverty is defined by World Bank and other institutions is in terms of income. So in the 1950s, there was a redistribution of land, and most people had their own plot of land. They could build their own homes, they could make their own clothes, they could grow their own food. So if you're looking at calories, if you're looking at make the ability to clothe oneself, feed oneself, heat one's food, and so forth, there were only about 100 million people in China total by 1980 that were underneath this absolute poverty line as defined by IMF. But that's a lot of people. 100 million people. In the United States, the
Mhm.
population is 350 million. So that seems like an enormous amount of people. For China in 1980, it was about a billion people. So that's about 1 in 10 people were in absolute poverty. Terrible. So during reform and opening up, Deng Xiaoping said, let some people get rich first. And then they pursued some market reforms in some ways. They let parts of capitalism and piecemeal under control in certain sectors of the economy. And
Mhm.
that did create temporarily a lot of economic growth until 1990. Then that didn't work out until 1995. And then it increased dramatically. And now there's no absolute poverty in the country. But I wanted to point out, it's not 800 million people that reform and opening up raised out of absolute poverty. It's only about 100 million people that reform and opening up are raised out of absolute poverty, because it's not defined as income. And most people use the figure from 2010 and then look backwards in time, which is not fair also. So the CPC did an enormous amount to help the people of China well before the market economy became part of the Chinese economy. But then the market economy, in fact, did help. And that's why China let it in. And that's why China is still opening up parts of its economy to increased capitalism, to foreign investment, FDI, and so forth. But are Chinese people poor? That's the thesis of the book you're talking about? No, no, they're
Mhm.
not. And they're also getting a lot richer. And one other thing, last thing, is the United States exported its industries. In the 1990s, I was living in
Mhm.
a town called Oakdale, California. They had a Hershey factory. Hershey factory moved to Mexico.
Mhm.
This is
There's one
something
about
par
3
for,
hours away from me.
right. Yeah, par for the course in. Yeah, right. Exactly. You're at the original Hershey factory. Right. Yeah, exactly. But this is par for the course of the United States. It exported all of its industries, became kind of a paper service economy. But in China, they're not doing that. They know, they learned from the U.S. bad example. They're like, well, let's not do that. So
Mhm.
what they're doing is they have more than half of all of the factory robots in the world here in China. China is 80% of all manufacturing in the world. It's like 63% of all of the high tech manufacturing, and they're doing inshoring, reshoring to the west, to these poorer regions, to help those people have the factory jobs that are no longer convenient for people in Guangzhou, Guangdong. And so where the factories were, some of those factories are moving, especially the low tech factories. They're moving to the western parts of China to allow this economic miracle to continue. So China is going to become richer and richer. I'm sorry, I keep saying last thing,
No, you're
last thing.
good. You're good. Go, go.
The GDP growth of China is 5% probably for this year. IMF expects it to be 5%. I think Morgan Stanley thinks it's going to be 5.2%. China's goal is 5%.
Mhm.
So it's going to meet its targets for this year. US GDP is probably going to grow about 2.6%. That's if it
What's
meets its
been?
targets. It rarely does.
Mhm.
Last year, China's economy grew at 5.2%. US economy grew by 2.5%. So China's economy grew at twice the speed of the United States. So in fact, China is adding a lot, about $1 trillion to its economy every year. Now, a lot of people say, oh, it's slowing down. That's true. It's graduating toward the mean. This is like an economic term, but it's
Mhm.
still been adding $1 trillion to its economy every year for the last like 7 or 8 years. So I'd say that's a win. Yes, it's not growing at 7% that it was growing at like 10 years ago, but
Mhm.
that's expected. All economists knew that this was going to happen as it graduated towards a much higher a development rate. It's harder to add 7% if your economy is basically the same size as the United States. In terms of purchasing power parity, China's economy is larger than the US already. In terms of nominal measurements, which include all kinds of like weird things. Like I don't even want to go
Mhm.
into that. The US economy is technically larger, but in terms of nominal, China's still going to pass the US by 2030. And in purchasing power parity, China's economy will be at least twice the size of the United States by about 2040, 2045.
Hmm.
So China's economy is just fine. Don't worry about people over here. Us Americans, we should be worrying about our home, what's going on at home.
Mhm.
And that's what I think a lot of politicians and academics don't want people looking at because it's inconvenient.
Yeah, man, there's a lot there. One follow up question, I guess, would be, people oftentimes bring up that China's debt to GDP, if I remember correctly, their debt to GDP is over 200%. I might have that number wrong. It might be like 150. It's been forever since I looked at these numbers, but between debt to GDP, they say like that sweet spot of where you're starting to go really, really south is like around 140, I think, and the U.S. is getting pretty close to that point. And then also I want to talk about like the whole trade wars, but what about like China's debt to GDP? What's the breakdown on that?
I don't remember who it was. It was like Bloomberg or something. They were
Mm,
like China's hidden debt, and they said some crazy figure like 273%.
mhm,
And that's just not true. China, if you look at the normal figures that China puts out, it's closer to like 100%.
mhm,
But there are all these Western institutions looking at shadow debt and like making up figures and like extrapolating things from inferring like how many, by counting certain kinds of like merchandise, and it's all made up. But if you look at the
sure.
official statistics, it's not. And the U.S. has a serious problem, and Japan has a
Mhm,
very, very, very serious problem with that. China's doing just fine. They're really
sure.
balanced in terms of their. Actually, they have like 3.5 trillion in offshore reserves cash. That's how
Mhm,
cash flush they are. So like they could just easily absorb that if they wanted to, but they choose to use have their finances organized in such a way that that has to stay outside of China. And so they use that for infrastructure, developing like hospitals and roads, bridges in Africa and stuff like that to get like 2% returns or 0% sometimes just to have it doing something. But no, China has is an enormous amount of cash, an enormous amount of money. They have massive trade surpluses. What's really bizarre about
mhm,
these things when they bring up debt is like the same people will say China has a trade surplus with the United States and it's draining our money and they're becoming rich off the
mhm.
working man in America. Then in the next article, the same person will write, China has so much debt their economy is going to collapse. It can't be both. I'm sorry, you have to choose one or the other.
Right. Yeah, and well, like I said, that kind of taps into like the whole trade war stuff where Trump and I hear right wingers talk about this all the time, who are very, very near and dear to my heart because once again, I'm a blue collar guy. I'm surrounded by blue collar people. I have been for the last 11 years. Um, they're like, oh, Trump was so tough on China. He had all these tariffs, which Biden conveniently ramped up, but they never talk about that. Um, he was really sticking it to China. And I talked to them about this, and much to your point, I'm like, well, China still has a trade surplus. Like, we lost the trade war. The tariffs fell 94% on American consumers, not companies, consumers. And then China
Yes.
only paid
It's a
6% of
hidden
those.
tax. It's extra tax that's just hidden in the
Exactly.
cost of the
So,
stuff. Yeah.
how does that, how does like China view that? And I also heard that somebody had threw this at me once, said, oh, China had some big banks collapse after the tariffs. I'm like, well, was that correlation? Is that causation? I don't know. I need you to elaborate. And of course, that's when, the hand waving goes and it gets dismissed.
Well, there were some banks that collapsed. None of the big ones. I
Yeah.
mean, the big ones are solid. Like probably the richest banks in the world. In fact, I think could probably find that statistic. I remember seeing
Mhm.
it like go. I look at an enormous amount of statistics each day. I probably see 1,000 diagrams.
Sure.
So China's banks are fine. There are some small local regional banks because China has a lot of little towns, second tier, third, fourth tier towns have their own banks, and some of those did collapse. Well, in China, central government always makes sure that the people are made whole. The working man, this is a people's government, and they
Mhm.
really are. So if I don't know what people know about socialism or whatever, but this is a socialist country, and the government is very socialist, and they do care first about the working person. I want to give an example. I made this. This is a little off topic, but I'll bring it back around. In the United States, companies are people. So, right. So a person, they have $2 million in debt in their company. They didn't manage it well and they're going to go bankrupt. Fine, they go bankrupt. The person who owns that company doesn't go bankrupt. The company and the assets go bankrupt. So the person who owns that company, whatever they paid themselves is whole at the end of that. So the capitalist class who own companies in the United States are protected by this law, which allows companies to be people. This law doesn't exist in China. Companies aren't people. You take liability when you own a company in China. So if I were to open a company, I become the CEO. I don't pay my employees, and I try to pay myself and declare bankruptcy. The government's coming from my bank account to make all my employees whole. And if I can't pay them, I'll spend the rest of my life indebted to my employees, and all of my money goes to them. So China is always looks out for the people. So when banks like fail, they go after that bank's assets and the people who own that bank, the people who have economic liability, and they make those people indebted to the people who lost their money and pay them back, whatever it is. This is what happened to the guy who owned Evergrande. He was
Yeah.
this really rich billionaire who had his own private elevator just for his own office. And he was like, no one can go on my elevator. I need to be on my elevator by myself. He's just one of these, bougie people that the working class in every country has a problem with. And he is not rich anymore.
Mhm.
All of his assets, all of his money, everything went to make people whole, not the investors. So the Western investors who were invested in these companies, you know, they got done over because
Right.
the China, when they went in to rectify things, they took the money from the rich people in China and the companies that were saying we're going to go bankrupt, and they finished those homes. They paid the workers to finish the homes for the people first. So the people who bought the homes were made whole. The workers for those companies were made whole. So yes, when we talk about yes, some small banks, because there's like thousands of banks in China, did one or two or three or four or five banks maybe go under? Sure. But what happened afterwards is never covered by the West. You do see protesters because protests happen in China, by the way.
Right.
You'll see protesters in front of the bank saying, hey, we want to be made whole. Guess what the government does? They take the assets of that bank, they take all the people who had liability, and they make those people whole to the best of their ability.
Mhm.
So yes, things happen in China like they do in the States. In the States, what happens is, oh, this is too big to fail. So they take all this
Right.
tax money from the people and they pay the richest people to keep things going. In China, it's the exact opposite. They take the money from the richest people and they make the people whole. So yeah, that happens. And I forget the first part of your question before we were talking about banks.
Oh, the trade wars and tariffs.
Oh
Somebody
yeah, yeah.
said,
I'm with you. I'm with the United
Mhm.
States, and I think China is too. Actually, China is essentially a very sophisticated group of business persons.
Mhm.
So if the United States wants to have a better trade outcome, we need to sit down at the table. So when
Right.
Blinken shows up and starts talking about Taiwan and don't send your ships
Huh.
too close to
The
Alaska or
worst
something,
person in the world,
he's
let's be honest.
he's wasting his time and wasting his breath creating tensions where there need not be tensions.
Right.
Instead, Blinken needs to come to the table and say, you know what? You need to buy a hell of a lot more sorghum. You said you're going to buy sorghum. We need you to buy triple sorghum what you bought last year, or triple oats, or whatever it is. The Chinese,
Mhm.
the number one commodity that the U.S. Sells to China, agricultural goods,
Yes.
and the U.S. is very sophisticated. I don't think people in America understand, because only 2 or 3% of American people work in farming. But
Mhm.
America is the agricultural leader of the world by far.
Yes.
No one comes close. California is like could feed the entire world on its own if it really wanted to.
Mhm.
So the United States needs to sit down and say, "Hey, we're importing this amount of stuff from you. You need to import that amount of stuff from us." And if Blinken came with the right attitude and the right team and sat down with the right goals and didn't lecture China about its, internal political affairs or whatever, human rights, when the United States has the worst human rights record in the world ever, like the United States could get business done. The problem
Mhm.
is no one is at the helm in the United States who actually wants to negotiate for the right things without first like pissing off their counterparts. The United States absolutely should have a reasonably balanced trade, imports and exports with China within nominal rates. That is
Mhm.
something that the United States could get if they just tried harder and were a little more respectful to their international peers.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I'm sure you know that respect for our international peers is not quite in the the NATO or AUKUS lexicon, unfortunately. So, one other thing I wanted to ask you about, well, there's two things. So the one would be, what about the ghost cities? Because we hear about this from some people as well, that China erects ghost cities to tear them down just to make it look like they're economically productive. What's the truth to that, or is that bullshit as well?
So, okay, I love the pictures of buildings crashing, not just because of whatever I just like it,
Mhm.
watching it. It's really fascinating. I love to see it in the United States, in China, wherever.
Sure.
It's Evergrande built some super condominiums,
Mhm.
and I think on, and they did blow those up because yeah, the real estate issue. There was I think the most famous ghost city was Ordos. It's a city in Mongolia, Inner Mongolia,
Mhm.
and now it's almost fully populated. But I remember watching a documentary in 2013 about how empty it was, and like it's going to waste and all this stuff. If you go there now, it's populated. Okay, I want to give you another example. So here in Beijing, I came in 2012. There were a few uh, exits from the subway that popped up in the middle of nowhere, like in the
Mhm.
near cornfields, right? I went to one of these. My wife said, "Oh, we're gonna go have dinner with our uncle." So I was like, "Okay, so let's take the subway." Sure. I got out of this like subway entrance and look around. There's not a building in sight. It's just like cornfields and stuff. And I'm like,
Mhm.
what is this? Why is there a subway exit in the middle of this like cornfield? Is like this for farmers to get into the city? And she's like, just be quiet, get in the car. There's a car coming. So later, that area now has like, okay, I was originally born in a city called Modesto, California. It's population of 200,000, and it has a
Mhm.
downtown area. And it's like the biggest downtown area till Stockton, right? So for them, it's a big deal. But anyways, if you go back to the same subway exit that I went to, it's bigger than the downtown of Modesto now. So what China does oftentimes is it builds the infrastructure before it's needed, knowing that later there's a step 2, a step 3, they're going to develop a whole area and a million people are going to move there. So they're really forward thinking in their planning. So cities like Ordos actually were planned early for populations that China is working on this urbanization. It's trying to move I think about up to about 60-65% of its entire population into urban centers to get them out of rural areas. In part, actually, to copy another America. This is another they want to copy America. America
Mhm.
has really great agricultural robotics and like mechanization at scale, massive scale. You have farms that are 100,000 acres. China didn't have that 20 years ago because of collectivization It was all these little farms are owned by individual people and communities and things. And so China looked at the United States during reform and opening up and was like, wow, America's, growing a lot more food than us, and we need that. So that's what China's trying to do. China's trying to make its rural areas more like the United States. This is another thing where they're like, that's something we can copy. And so if I was a Chinese person, my wife, for example, she's a city hukou. She can't go to the countryside and buy land. That land is only for rural people for a couple different reasons. Number one, they don't want rich city people going and buying up all the farmland. And number two, they want to make these massive farms like the United States has. So as people leave those areas, they say, oh, you're leaving, then you have to sell it to us. Or, you pass away, you have to sell it to us, back to the government, so that they can create these massive super farms. So these cities like Ordos and these other ghost cities were built during urbanization to collect people from the countryside into cities where there are hospitals, where there's schools, where they can be better taken care of, and where farmland outside of those cities can then be utilized to provide food security for China. So whereas there used to be a few of these ghost cities, not anymore. They're populated. And in the case where there may be a couple left over, that's because people moved somewhere else and it wasn't planned as well as it would like. I mean, there's mistakes made in government. China's not perfect, but China is doing a hell of a job.
Interesting. The other, well, okay, so perhaps we should get in some more of the spicy stuff that people kind of level at China. And I've debunked a lot of this stuff, but I'm kind of curious about your perspective. Obviously, being a former American and then also kind of living there for as long as you have. The one thing that gets leveled at China a lot is that they're sending fentanyl over the border to kill hundreds of thousands of Americans at a time. Now, I know the answer to this, but perhaps my audience doesn't, and perhaps you could expand upon a little bit more of what I know.
Oh, I'd be interested to hear your answer after I finish. So what I've learned, okay, firstly, we Americans need to look at our country again. If you look at the statistics, I go to Our World in Data. I would recommend anyone who wants to know about the world, go to Our World in Data. I don't get money from you sending you there, by the way. There's great graphs on every kind of topic you can imagine. Not every topic, but a lot. Almost everything. And if you can go and look at drug deaths and deaths by all kinds of different things. It's one of the different categories you can look at. And if you look at cocaine deaths, United States is off the map. It's like there's like a chart, and you put all the countries in the world on it, and it's like all the countries how bad they're doing at deaths, and then it's like the United States. So like if you look at cocaine deaths, if you look at opiate deaths, if you look at methamphetamine deaths, death by alcohol, the United States is the global leader in all of them. So I mean, the United States, for whatever reasons we want to talk about, I think it's a much deeper and longer conversation, has a huge problem with drugs, especially overusing drugs, especially in the developed world. You think people are dying like this in Japan or France or Germany? No, this is a very US problem, very unique US problem that Americans love to do illegal and legal drugs and kill themselves at it. So we have to look at that firstly. And then China, if you look at China, China doesn't have drugs. I mean, it's impossible. If I were to go out and start looking for drugs, I'd never find them. And I'd probably end up in jail long before I was able to find anything. But fentanyl is a legal precursor for a lot of medical drugs that are manufactured in the United States. And China and medical institutions get licenses and order fentanyl to the United States to make drugs. They're not life-saving drugs, but they're painkillers and things, especially for like cancer patients. Really horrible situations where someone needs long-term painkillers to deal with excruciating deaths, basically, and other things too. So the United States needs fentanyl, and China manufactures fentanyl for them. Now, the number one source for the illegal fentanyl that is misused by Americans is not China, but Mexico. So if you look at all of the data, it really looks like, what was it? Nikki Haley. I think she was the leader at this. She was like, oh, China's killing us with fentanyl.
Yeah,
I don't think
her and Marjorie Taylor Greene were the two saying that they always throw out ridiculous numbers. I've looked into the numbers. They say it's like 200,000 people a year, something crazy.
Really,
Yeah.
that'd be like 1 out of 1,000 people almost. I don't think it's that bad.
It's not.
I mean,
it's not.
It's clearly, and also there's a council. There is a U.S. state website that
Mhm.
is a council for China-US cooperation to make sure that fentanyl that originates in China does not end up in the United States illegally. And so they work really closely to make sure that any factories or any institutions in China are not illegally sending fentanyl to Mexico or to the United States. And so it's looked at very carefully by the US State Department. So for US politicians to say that China is somehow illegally smuggling fentanyl in to kill Americans is ridiculous, because Americans want to abuse drugs.
Mhm.
And most of those drugs are coming from Mexico. And not that it's always originating in Mexico. I'm not trying to paint Mexico bad. Sorry, Mexico. But like, it's, clearly it's not a malicious intent on the behalf of China to flood American cities with drugs to make them kill themselves. It's a ludicrous, absolutely, it's a sci-fi movie plot. It's bizarre.
Yeah, one of the comments kind of corroborated what you said. It's a Mexican cartel that is making the fentanyl. They buy the ingredients and make it in Mexico.
Mhm.
As far as I understand, that's the way that that they do it. Um, the other thing that I'd be really curious about your perspective on. Oh, I guess I should add on. I remember reading a graph about the way that fentanyl kind of gets produced in traffic, and I remember reading that China outlawed trafficking fentanyl back in April of 2019. And originally started looking at this in like 2022 because it was the lead ups to the midterms, and a lot of Republicans were kind of waving their hands about it. And then when I looked into it, I'm like, oh, that's just like completely wrong. Like I think it was they said fentanyl was the leading cause of death for young people in America, and that it was some insane amount of people a day. But then when I looked into it, um, it just wasn't corroborated at all. I'd have to go back to the podcast and listen, but basically they inflate these numbers. They just throw something at the wall and say, "Oh, this many people are dying from fentanyl a day." So the two other things that kind of get flown around a lot. Let's start with the social credit system. We're told that there's this dystopian, nightmarish social credit system in China where if you criticize the government, you lose points from your social credit score, and then you could get thrown in jail. I've heard a lot of different stories about this, but I'm curious about your experience with it, even if it's a thing.
I think it was 2016-17 when there was a very interesting incident in which a Chinese passenger on a South Korean flight threw a cup noodles into the what do they call flight attendants now,
Mhm.
into her face. And so this created a lot of uproar around the world, not just in China. Everyone was like, wow, Chinese travelers are so rude. And China was in, Chinese community on Weibo was outraged too, and they were so embarrassed. People were really calling this person out. There was this. We're talking about when China something blows up on the internet, it's not like in the United States. When people say in the United States, "Oh, it went viral," they mean like maybe 1 million or 2 million people saw it. And they're like, "Oh,
Yeah.
wow, it's viral." In China, when something goes viral, there's like 500-600 million people talking about it for a couple of days. It
Mhm.
really goes viral. And this is
Yeah.
often China's like this. It moves together when a topic becomes an issue, everyone's talking about it. Everyone's talking about the same few things every few days. And so when this woman did this, oh my gosh. So they actually did start to develop some kind of system to make sure, because there was a couple of incidents around the same time that were similar, and mostly in China, and they were like, okay, we need to do something about these bad travelers. And so the government actually reacted. The government's very reactive to whatever the people want. And
Mhm.
so they actually started installing these signs in for jaywalkers as part of this, where it's then they still have some of them. And so if you jaywalk, and there's only like 3 or 4 of these in the entire country of China, but if you start to jaywalk, the sign will show, it'll show your face, and it'll have facial recognition and say your name and shame you. How dare you jaywalk? And so these exist, and I want to go to them because it sounds like a lot of fun. I'm going to go jaywalk there for sure. Oh my god, I'm not going to just be like showing people who jaywalk. I'm going to jaywalk and film my face appearing. But China very quickly was like, this is not a good idea, and they did, the whole thing was called off, and the hysteria died down, and the public moved on. Now I happen to know, I'm not going to say how I know or what their names are, or even what cities they live in or anything. Some people who did not pay their employees. They owned some companies that had some debt. I'm not even going to say what industry. and they didn't pay their employees. So they were brought before a judge, and they owes about 20 million RMB to their interests, and that's a lot. That's a couple $1,000,000. It's like
Right.
$2 or $3 million. So these people, by court order, are not allowed to travel first class on trains and planes, but they can travel. And they're not allowed to stay in 5 or 4-star hotels, but they're allowed to stay in hotels. This is not because of some AI driven system, but it's because a judge said. Now, if you go to the United States, if someone commits fraud, they go to jail. Or they have certain limitations in their travel also, like they can't leave the country or the state or their city, for example. So the same thing kind of happens in the United States. So people like to look at examples like what I'm talking about. And okay, there's another example that it is somewhat true. Okay, if you go to California and you have these perverts, right, pedophilia or whatever, they have some kind of
Mhm.
system. It's like, I forget what it's called. It's named after some child who was.
The
Uh,
Amber Alerts, I think it
no, it's
is.
not Amber. It's a
Mhm.
website. You can find out which one of your neighbors has a
I know
flag.
I know exactly what
I
you're
forget
talking
the
about. I
name of it.
just can't think of
I
it.
haven't seen it in 10 years. But there's a system where you can find out where these people live to make sure that you don't hang out with them or let your kids hang out with them,
Mhm.
for example, to keep your kids safer in California. It's only in some states. But China has this for people who have not paid their debts, where they've been in front of a judge, so that they don't do business with these people. They can be careful not to loan them money and stuff. And so
Mhm.
there is, in fact, a system, a website to find these people and to locate them. I don't think they have one for rapists, like, or but uh, they have one for people who've committed fraud. So this
Mhm.
exists. So oftentimes you'll see that system being used by someone who's trying to say that there's a social credit system, and they'll say,
Mhm.
haha, look, don't hang out with these people or your social credit score will go down. The problem with that argument is there isn't a social credit score. There's no automated system by which people play too many video games and get in trouble. Or, like, what is it? I don't know. I watch too many movies, or I don't know, download
Yeah.
pornography or something weird like that, and they get in trouble and they have marks again. No. And if you go and read Marxist literature or something, you don't get bonus points. There's nothing like that. It doesn't exist. There are people who've committed fraudulent activity. And so the government, a socialist government again, does not want the rich people taking advantage of the poor people. This is another example of how China looks out for the working class first.
Mhm.
And it wants to make sure that they're not taken advantage of by the predatory, like, rich capitalist people. So it puts in these in places like people need to be made whole. Like, if you owe debts, you have to pay those debts. It's especially because taking out money and not paying it back is very predatory, and that's something that happens
Right.
in the United States. But it's looked after very carefully here. There is no social credit score. If someone owes millions of RMB because their company didn't pay them, yeah, they may see a judge. That judge may pass a special thing for them, just like happens in the United States. And then there are ways to monitor those people, but there's no automated AI system. No, it doesn't exist. It doesn't. I mean, I've asked thousands of people, and I've
Mhm.
looked at everything, and it just doesn't exist.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, that seems to be the same answer I got from Carl. Carl kind of explained it a little bit of a different way as to like when he was in elementary school. If you misbehaved, then that could kind of carry with you over a period of time. And then what you're saying, it actually kind of makes sense because I mean, you would want to know if there's known predators around to kind of avoid those people. So the other spicy thing that's gotten thrown out a lot, if you watch Tim Pool, who I used to really like him, but I can't stand him anymore because I think he's just anyways, he had on these people from I think it was called China Uncensored, and they made the claim that the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province are being genocided. Adrian Zenz published a paper about this, and I've debunked this plenty of times, but I'm curious to your thoughts on it. And that they're also performing organ harvesting on this group of people in China. So, what's your knowledge of this? Is this true? Have you seen it? Have you heard about it? What's the deal?
It's an incredibly serious accusation, and it
Mhm.
should be taken seriously. So, I'm the first. When I went there, my eyes were wide open, looking for any sign of anything, because
Mhm.
that is something you would want to stop. Anyone
Right.
would want to stop. So, like, very serious evidence needs to be provided that it's happening, and mostly the evidence is like some Uyghur people who are associated with living in Washington D.C. and Langley. are the same people that they keep parading around in circles. So that's their evidence. Some people, and Adrian Zen's made up numbers.
Right.
But if you okay, so after the figures for 2 and 3 million were largely debunked by Gray Zone, and then this
Yes.
repeated through the internet, and sane people read this and were like, "Well, yeah, that doesn't make any sense." Like they actually transitioned to cultural genocide. We're no,
Yes.
they're not actually killing people. They're erasing their culture. They're erasing their language. They're not allowed to practice Islam. So that's where it transitioned 5 or 6 years ago. For the vast majority of people in this argument, were like, okay, we were wrong. They're not killing people. They're erasing their culture. Okay, sure. I went to Xinjiang, and so I went to Xinjiang last year in the erasing culture argument, and I looked for this, and I looked also just okay, people our age, people between the age of 16 and like 50, males especially, right? Are they present, right, in normal numbers in society? Yes. And there were not just people dressed up in Uyghur clothes, in traditional clothes that they wore 100 years ago. There were a lot of Uyghur men our age playing basketball and like Nikes and, Adidas shorts and like tank tops. Like it was just, and then there were Uyghurs who were dressed up in more traditional clothing. It was not one uniformity kind of thing. And also, you have to also keep in mind that Xinjiang is not just home to Uyghurs. It is home to Tajiks and Kazakhs and people from Afghanistan culture and Pakistanis. It's a very ethnically rich place with 20 ethnic minorities of China living in this one place. And so when I was looking at signage, like street signs, they're bilingual. They're in Chinese, and then they're also in Uyghur, almost everywhere, because I was in the South primary, which is the larger Uyghur concentration area when I was traveling. But there were some signs that were actually in 3 languages or 4 languages. So the street sign, like stop signs, or how far you need to go, or the name of the road ahead, there would be like multiple languages. And I took pictures of this. I posted it on the internet multiple times. And I even asked people when I'm there, what's that? And they're like, oh, I don't know. Because it'd be like an Arabic script, and they'd be like, that's Uyghur. And it would be like another Arabic script. And what's that? I don't know what that is. So it might be Tajik or something else, another Arabic script. So signs everywhere are multilingual, not bilingual. And most of them are bilingual. Elevator signs, restaurant menus. Turn the radio on. I brought a radio with me, but they also played it in the truck. Radio broadcasts are in Uyghur. So music is in Uyghur. And then you go to mosques, they're open. There's people dressed up to go into the mosque in their traditional, Islamic attire, going into the mosque, praying in the mosque. And I didn't just go to one mosque. I went to at least 2 mosques in every city that I went to, and I went to 6 cities. So they were freely practicing Islam. And also I took off from the group, right? There's the main group I went with on the tour group, and I left. I just took off sometimes, walked in the wrong direction. Oops. Well, what's over here? And I walked for blocks and blocks and blocks, and I'd find another mosque, and there'd be people there, or Uyghur people selling Uyghur food and Uyghur clothes and like normal modern clothes, and normal young people our age doing normal people stuff. I went to a town square where there was dancing one night. It was like second night I was there. We were being brought on a tour through some like a I don't know, like a night market street. It was like full of like different ethnicities, yummy food and stuff. And I was like, I don't want to be here. This is clearly where maybe they want us to go. So I left. I got a car. I got a taxi. I went a few blocks over to some People's Square with one friend. And when I got there, this huge People's Square is filled with like 10,000 people. Chinese scale, you have to think it's really big sometimes. And so I went around, and there at night, Damas dance in China. So there's dancing at night in the evenings. And so there's groups of dancers, and I have this all video. I still have it all saved up. I posted it last year, and I walked around, and there's like groups of people in like green jumpers all dancing together to like Chinese music. And then you go to another place, and there's a big group of Uyghur people dancing in Uyghur ways with Uyghur, big boom boxes. And you go to another place, and there's a different group of people, maybe pop, maybe rap, American rap, all kinds of just stuff dancing. There's all these people in different groups of 100 or 200 people everywhere dancing. And it was instantly clear right then in that moment. I was just like, okay, propaganda. Like you have, the language is spoken freely. The language is used on the radio. The language is on the signs. The food is being sold. The mosques are open. If they're erasing culture, I'm not sure what part of the culture they're erasing, because it's not obvious to me. And that's been the experience of everyone that I know. I know Fernando Munez from Colombia. He and I are very good friends. And He went there for 3 months. I think it was 4 months actually, in an RV, just driving around wherever he wanted to go. And he posted every day videos of just kids that he was meeting and people selling food. It was also the same experience for him. My experience was only 8 days. His experience was 4 months. Both of us had the same experience. Jerry Gray bicycled across Xinjiang 3 times, 2,000 kilometers, same experience. So, I mean, I encourage, you don't need a permit to go. This is a misunderstanding. You don't need special permission. You don't need to sign up for you. If you can get a visa to China, just go. Just go to Xinjiang. You want to see if they're erasing people's culture? Go there. I guarantee you they're not.
Yeah, that seems to track with most of the things that I've heard and kind of read about. Jason, I know you were on a little bit of a time crunch. This was very, very enlightening. So I guess I want to throw a couple more questions at you, just real quick. Is
Sure.
everything we heard as U.S. citizens about China a lie?
Like I said at the beginning of the show, I don't think Bloomberg and the New York Times sometimes get China wrong because they are trying to get China wrong. I think they get China wrong because they don't understand China. Like the economy, for example, one of the figures that Bloomberg keeps recycling is the reason they keep saying the economy is not doing well is because they look at this number, consumer confidence. And consumer confidence, if you look at the statistics and real statistics, it's weak. One of the reasons for that is because China's transitioning from a manufacturing economy to a service economy, which is necessary. And even the economists who are pro-China that I talk to say this is necessary, that they need to have this dual circulation economy. And there's a problem, and it is a problem. Chinese consumers save money really well. Like I gave through this figure out, 40% savings earlier. Sounds great for an American. Wow, they save so much money. For an individual, great. For society, not so great. What we really do need Chinese people to splash the cash. They need to spend more money. It is
Mm.
true. But the GDP growth is phenomenal. The manufacturing jobs are phenomenal. The economy is actually doing really well. But in order to keep it going well in a few years, Chinese people need to spend more. So China's the people leading this country, they know this too, and they're making sure this happens. And so one of the things that happens is Chinese people love to spend when they travel. When they travel, Chinese people let go of their money way bigger than we do. We're like, haha, I'm on a trip. I will only go to the 7-Eleven. I'm in Japan, right? So, like, just this. But in China, they're like, oh, we're in Japan, money. And so,
Yeah.
one of the things, and they buy luxury goods. They go to like Prada and stuff when they're in Paris. They're like, we're finally in Paris. Let's spend all of our money. So China's realizing this, and they're trying to like get Chinese people by following consumer habits to be in situations where they spend more money. And so, and this is starting to happen, especially with the millennials. They're buying way more boba teas. They're going on more trips. They're spending more online. They're buying more products on JD and so forth. So it is happening. The transition, and especially the last couple months, which the figures aren't really out on that much, especially this last month in July, consumer spending is actually starting to go up. And so we're seeing a trend away from this. The thing is about Western economists who misrepresent China is that oftentimes they don't look at all the other figures. They do look at very specific metrics that make China look bad. So I think they are trying to spin a little bit. They're like, haha, China's not doing so well. We found a metric that's not working for you. But if you look at all the other metrics, it's doing great. So yes, when you read the media, whatever the reason is, it in the West, it is wrong mostly on most issues about China, unless they're talking about like pandas. Then it's like insanely accurate.
That's
The
hilarious.
panda stuff is like really accurate, but everything
Mhm.
else is wrong.
Like I said, I know you're on a little bit of a time crunch, but I feel like I'd be remiss. And you could say we could do this in a follow-up show if you like, but what about the Taiwan situation? Is it that dire, and how do people view the Taiwan situation? Which, once again, if you feel like this, warrants a follow-up show, I'm good with that, but I'll put that ball in your court.
All right. Well, let's do the facts first, and then I'll decide whether I want to give my opinion because it's
Sure.
one of those things. Um, the fact is, the United States has a one China policy, and the fact that every
Correct.
president has followed this policy, even Blinken, he invited the senior Chinese delegate to have a press conference in D.C. about 3 years ago, and no, I think it was last year, and they stood together, and Wang Yi was like, A, B, C, D. seat. America agrees that Taiwan is part of China, blah, 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 blah. Lincoln literally came up after him and just said, I agree with everything he said. And then that was his whole
Mhm.
speech.
Right.
So, like, there is no contestation that in the United Nations recognizes one China with Taiwan as part of China and its capital in Beijing, and even the Taiwanese constitution, if you look at their own constitution, recognizes one China. The difference is they put the capital in Taipei. So there is one China in China, and there's one China in like every country in the world except, like, I think it's about 5 or 6 countries that are like really tiny countries, by the way, that are like basically, I wouldn't say insignificant, but like on the global scale, they're not major players who recognize Taiwan as the capital of one China. But all the other countries recognize Beijing as the capital of one China. So the one China policy is officially the United Nations policy, and it's officially the US policy. So Taiwan is part of China. I mean, anyone who says different is propagandizing you, because that is the reality. Um, does the question, I think, for a lot of people is the mainland planning on invading Taiwan to make it part of China? There, China reserves the right to be able to do that if there is interference by external bodies. So if the United States were to come in and say, we're going to make sure that Taiwan is its own country, then it would probably be, they would be initiating a war. Or if Taiwan said, we no longer believe in the one China policy, we are our own country, then that probably would escalate the situation to conflict. But these things are not probable unless the United States is looking for a war. And I don't really think the United States is. I think the United States is just playing a game to antagonize China because it wants to maintain its first island chain. Another thing I would like to say is I know everyone, including the people I talk to, thinks semiconductors are a big deal.
Mhm.
They're not. The United States would be using a different excuse to talk about Taiwan and its significance if the semiconductors were not a part of the deal. If they weren't being manufactured in Taiwan, the United States would create a different reason to create conflict.
Mhm.
The United States' primary interest in Taiwan is it's part of its first island chain to contain China. And so they want to maintain that buffer so that the US international security architecture that it designed is maintained in a certain kind of way. For China, they have mainland China. They really don't want to invade Taiwan. They see Taiwanese people as their brothers. So, and their sisters, their family, and part of China. They don't want to see bloodshed. Sometimes Xi Jinping will say, or someone else will say, we need to be prepared for war, and they'll talk about Taiwan. That's only because they're concerned about conflict driven by the outside to cleave Taiwan away. The
Mhm.
plan in China is to make the mainland so appetizing and so important that Taiwan slowly integrates economically more and more to the point where there is no difference anymore. So most, not most, many Taiwanese people study at universities in mainland. And many people in the mainland study at universities in Taiwan. And most of the business for Taiwan, I'm talking more than half of all imports and exports from Taiwan, go to China's mainland. So they are, in fact, very intimately bound. And I don't even think the Taiwanese government is silly enough to do anything to make that situation change. And if you look at the balance of power, the reality is China is outgrowing the United States and other powers, especially the other G7 powers outside of the United States. I think UK is in negative growth or like 0.2 growth or something. So the rest of the G7 insignificant. It's really the United States. So as China's economy becomes more and more important, especially to Taiwan, eventually Taiwan will be like, it makes more sense to be in some kind of, you know, uh, alliance system or treaty, economic treaty, or whatever it's going to be the first step to move
Mhm.
towards even more closer with China's mainland, which is insanely close already. If you go to Fujian, you walk around, Taiwanese people are everywhere. So go to Fujian, go to Fuzhou, go to Xiamen. There's Taiwanese people at the universities. You walk around, there's Taiwanese people everywhere. You can talk to them about their feelings, and most of them have family on both sides, work business on both sides. So I think the United States hypes it up. Also, there's another
Mhm.
reason I think that you would agree the United States hypes it up is because they need to keep funding the Pentagon way more than they need. And so
Yep.
creating enemies everywhere is a way to bloat the, in military industrial complex.
Yeah. I think one reason why I hit on this so much is because, much like Israel, there is universal consent for arming Taiwan and Israel. There's some dissent on Ukraine, but when it comes to Taiwan and Israel, very, very rarely does anybody break on that. And, I'm sure you know just as well as I do that the main goal of the US is that they're saying, hey, we're going to fight a war with China. Like they are the number one threat. So we got to do everything we can to kind of stick them in the eye. And, just a lot of the foreign policy of Joe Biden, and then to a lesser degree in Trump's first term, was to kind of, start provoking China. And then, Joe Biden gets in the meeting with Nancy Pelosi over in Taiwan, specifically kind of stuck it in their eyes. And then, flying war or, sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait, arms guarantees to the Philippines, stuff that I talk about a lot. It's the reason why I bring this up so much because, like, I don't want that war. We don't need that war. I don't think China wants that war. And, like you said, I don't even think America really wants that war. But there's so many hungry mouths at the Pentagon that just say, hey, we got to keep, the stock for Boeing up sky high. We need to get more 2,000-pound bombs over to Taiwan, or, have spy planes that fly off the coast of China, or, put our troops right off the coastline of Kinmen, I think it was,
That's right.
over
Yeah,
the
you can
summer.
see it. You can see
Yeah.
it.
It's just absolute insanity. And I think it's all
It's a
so
tripwire. It's
unnecessary.
clearly a
Yes.
tripwire.
Yeah. But yeah, I think that
Yeah.
stuff's so unnecessary, and I would hate to see anything like that happen. So, um, the read that I get of the situation generally is that Taiwan doesn't want that situation either, and that the Democratic People's Party are a little bit more progressive, like they kind of want independence, but they also understand the situation. And then the Kuomintang is a little bit more like, hey, this just is what it is. We're going to work with the situation. We would like to declare independence, but just is what it is.
I mean, I'm not going to disagree with you. I think there are a lot of Taiwanese people who are, in fact, interested in independence. But also
Mhm.
think that given enough time, people are probably going to move away from that opinion. Not because of
Sure.
militarism, not because of like Air Force drills or something, but because it'll make economic sense and we'll want to integrate. Imagine, I don't know, if there was a, see, if Guam, can Guam actually become more than a territory of the United States? Can it become a state? Is that possible? Do they get to vote for that? I know that Puerto Rico does, but I'm sure that a lot of places around the world would love to be part of the United States because of its insane wealth.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what's going to happen here. I mean,
Gotcha.
that's my non-factual part. That's just my
Mhm.
opinion about the future. But the facts are Taiwan's really part of China economically, politically, even if you
Mhm.
go down there, hang out. I've been to both sides. I've been to Fuji and I've been to Taiwan. And what's interesting? I was in Taipei. There are protests for and against joining China's mainland. There were protests for that. They were like, we need to join China. And there were protests in the street against that I saw with my own eyes in the street. So they're like torn too.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, like I said earlier, this is all just super fascinating stuff to me, and hopefully the audience finds it engaging and interesting as well, because I don't think we get to hear this kind of perspective very often. Once again, we just get the specifically people in my niche love the Tim Pool, the Steve Bannon, the populist right, and they're all about just, screw China, man. They're screwing us over. And I never
Well,
even heard anybody late. Oh god, god.
on that, I would like to talk about the way forward because I don't think this
Yeah.
gets enough. There's a factory in near Columbus, Ohio, called I forget, Illuminate USA. It's a joint venture between a Chinese company and a U.S. company,
Mhm.
and they hired 1,000 American workers to make solar with Chinese technology, which is more advanced. And this is for the U.S. market and for export from the United States. So you have 1,000 American good jobs working in a factory, right? This is the ideal job. I mean, I would have loved that kind of job actually. You work in you get really great security. So you get these 1,000 Americans making solar in America, and for export, JVing with the Chinese company. And there are other factory examples like this in the United States where Chinese companies are coming over and trying to offshore some of their manufacturing to the United States. If
Mhm.
we did, Congress is sometimes resistant to this and sometimes it's not. Sometimes communities are resisting this and sometimes they're not. But it creates jobs. And those 1,000 jobs become 10,000 because you have the people have to build their houses and deliver their food.
deliver their packages and mow their lawns and all that stuff. So, these 1,000 jobs become 10,000 in the US. So, if more Chinese JVs for solar, batteries, and other advanced Chinese technologies move to the United States, that is a really great way for us to work together, where we
Yeah.
can find the places where we both have an advantage, a strategic advantage, and work together as a team. And I think that's what China wants. So if someone, like I said earlier, could sit down and work out a really fair way for imports and exports to work, the two of us can do great things together.
I think that should be the goal, though, is that, a rising tide lifts all boats, and it's not a
Right.
zero sum game. Like, human prosperity doesn't have to be either or. Like, this can literally be just why don't China, Russia, and the US all work together to say, hey, we're going to pick up where everybody leaves off. So, like you said earlier, China imports billions of dollars of food from the US. Okay, well, I mean, if they're still willing to do the manufacturing and buy our food and we can feed ourselves and other people, well, why should we want to put tariffs on that or screw other people? Like, why not just say, hey, you know what? You have what we need, we have what you need. Let's trade and let's help each other out. Because once again, rising tide lifts all boats. We don't have to fight wars. We could have a prosperous human civilization. It doesn't have to be prosperous America, a prosperous China, or a prosperous Russia. It could be everybody. Everybody's good. You just got to quit dropping 2,000-pound bombs on one another, and just say, hey, you know what? We're gonna have a defense force at home to take care of ourselves, but like we're not gonna go abroad looking for these fights. Like that's ridiculous. We don't have to do that.
I would go further than you. I mean, I think the United States, while we have 150 official kind of bases and 800 little tiny bases all over the world, some in hotels and stuff, like
Mhm.
I think we do need bases abroad. I don't think we need 150. I think we need 20. We need to be able to
Mhm.
refuel our ships and stuff. And we need to be
Sure.
able to protect trade and stuff. I'm not saying the United States should pack up its military. I'm saying it should stop wasting exorbitant amounts of money on its military
Yeah.
unnecessarily, and we should invest in home, like you're saying. But I do think the United States should have a global presence, absolutely, a military global presence to maintain security and American interests. But it shouldn't be anything like the monster that we've created.
Yeah, I completely agree. Jason, this was an amazing conversation. I definitely think we should do it again sometime. And
Great.
I would
Thank you,
love
Kyle.
to kind of get to know more people in your kind of hemisphere and talk to more people from your metaphorical neck of the woods because, like I said, I've enjoyed learning about this so much because I don't think people get to hear these perspectives a lot. And for me, it was very enlightening. And I think a lot of other people would be enlightening as well. So feel free tell everybody where they can find you, support you, all that good stuff. And like I said, I really, really appreciate your time.
Well, you can find us at The Bridge Podcast. You can just Google us. Acorn Studios makes it easier to find us specifically. Or you can find me under my Chinese name, Shang Guanjiawan, at my Twitter, where I'm every day, just all over the place.
Nice. All right. Well, Jason, I really appreciate it. Once again, we'll do it again sometime. And if you don't got anything else, we'll call our stream there.
Thank you so much for your time, Kyle.
Of course. Thank you. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Take care.